Why don't we go somewhere where it's warm and pleasant right now? For example, to Zanzibar. Let's start with the island's capital, Stone Town. It's no wonder why it got this name. The island of Zanzibar is of coral origin, which means that almost the entire island is surrounded by a large sandy beach, and the middle of the island is made of porous coral stones. The entire city of Stone Town is built from these stones. This building rock is quite fragile, so most of the buildings in the city are in a state of emergency, especially in areas with more traffic. It's good that the city is included in the UNESCO Heritage List and is being maintained and restored. On the first day, when we go out into the street, we immediately feel the attention of the locals. Very polite people approach us, talk to us, and eventually offer us a guide, taxi, or safari services. After we politely refuse, another person approaches us, also polite, even overly so. We didn't last more than an hour in the city on the first day. We returned to the hotel and spent the rest of the time there. The next day, we already knew what to expect and were polite but specific. The city streets are full of people hiding from the sun. There are Muslims, Indians, Africans, and some white people. The city has many cultures, which is reflected in the architecture of the city. It is difficult to even imagine how they all managed to get along so peacefully. To tell the truth, it was not always like this. These narrow streets hide a very dark history of humanity. Let's take a look at how this strange and peculiar city came to be. The island of Zanzibar, due to its strategic location, was very convenient for trade with the tribes living on the African continent. As a result, Arab merchants settled on the island, thus spreading Islam and their culture. However, everything was ruined by the Portuguese, who were looking for routes to India. This strategic location was also very convenient for the island, mainly for the spice trade. Thus, the island was under Portuguese control for 200 years, until soon the Europeans were driven out by the Arabs. Thus, the island was taken over by the sultans of Oman. From this moment began the darkest period in the history of this entire region. During it, Stone Town became the most famous and richest city in East Africa because there was a huge slave market here. The main commodity here was people brought from the vast territory of Africa. Arab merchants themselves traveled to the depths of Africa, thus recruiting local tribal leaders. The latter always had something to sell, because slavery had long been entrenched among them. Becoming a slave was not difficult. It was enough to not pay a debt. Entire caravans would set out from the depths of Africa, which were joined by the first travelers and explorers, because it was safer to travel that way at that time. They were the first to describe all the atrocities and all the suffering of slaves traveling on foot without sleep and almost without food. Slavery was very closely related to the ivory trade. Every slave who arrived in Zanzibar also took one tusk. It is estimated that for each tusk, 5 people were captured or killed. And how much was one tusk worth at that time? For example, 5 billiard balls could be carved from one tusk. Huge quantities of slaves were brought to the island per year, 40 to 50,000. A third stayed on the island to work on local farms. An interesting fact is that cloves were grown here most of all. Other slaves were sold in markets and taken to another Asian country, because at that time, the slave trade was already prohibited in the West. In Zanzibar, everyone earned money from slavery. There were even slaves who invested all their money in slavery. There were no thoughts about prosperity. Stone Town was in a constant state of gloom, because the bodies of dead slaves and animals were thrown on the surrounding beaches. In addition, the city had no sewage system or garbage disposal system. Visiting Europeans would talk about Zanzibar with disgust. At that time, ideas about abolishing slavery were already spreading in Europe. In most places, the slave trade had already been banned. It wasn't long before the British began to put pressure on the sultans of Oman, blocking sea trade routes, until they finally got their way and the slave trade was banned in 1876. Of course, the black slave market still operated until 1900, but the point is that the last slave market on Earth was abolished. Although Zanzibar later became a British protectorate, the island still remained Muslim. All the Arab merchants, having accumulated wealth, mainly controlled the land, while ordinary people were left to live with the grievances of the past and continued to live on the verge of poverty. All it took was a spark for something terrible to happen. And as soon as the British left the island in 1963, a revolution broke out, during which most of the Arabs were simply killed or driven from the islands. The West simply ignored all this. Only a few helicopters flew over the island and captured the horrific images. 12,000 or so died in a few days. Of course, it is difficult to justify such carnage. This whole story is about the terrible nature of humanity.
Just dust on the ground, dust on the ground. If I was a slave, if I was a slave, if I was a slave, if I was chained, if I was chained, if I was chained, if I was chained, let me be chained to your love. If I was a slave, let me be a slave for the kingdom come. If I was in prison, sentence me for a million years in the glory.
We leave Stonetown for a while and sail to look at the islands located nearby. In just half an hour, we reach the island, where most tourists are brought. Previously, a prison was built on the island, which is why the island was called Prison Island. In fact, this building never fulfilled its function, because the island began to be used as a quarantine station for yellow fever. These days, it is a small tourist island with a small white sand beach. By the way, there is also a coral reef here, but I didn't see anyone swimming or snorkeling here. The old prison building didn't impress me. I liked watching the island's fauna more. Beautiful peacocks, very small deer, and of course, large turtles. The latter never lived here. But in 1919, the governor of Seychelles donated 4 huge turtles, who really liked this island. They bred a lot of them here, even up to 200, but the locals began to steal them, usually for food or sell them as pets. The number of turtles began to decline sharply, and when there were only 7 left on the island, the authorities took measures. They established a protected reservoir. Now these turtles are considered an endangered species all over the world, which is why many turtles are brought here, because it is safer for them here. A lot of tourists visit here. They are allowed to touch and feed the turtles, so most of them do this. We tried not to touch them, just to look around. We move on. Our goal is another uninhabited island, Nuka Penida. The island is so tiny that it doesn't even have a history. Its only life cycle is to go underwater every day and then resurface, because during high tides it is completely submerged, and during low tides a narrow strip of white sand appears. This is a real corner of paradise. White sand, blue water, and warm ocean waves. Places like this are rarely empty. Many tourists come here to feel like they are in paradise for a while and eat a seafood barbecue. After a while, you wonder if you would want to stay here alone for more than half a day. There is no shade here, and there is no fresh water either. It is not clear when the island will go under the ocean waves again, so we don't stay here long and return to the capital for sunset. Life in the city comes to a standstill at noon, because even the locals can't stand the heat. As the evening approaches, everyone becomes more active, which is especially noticeable closer to the coast. Children after a hot day swim and demonstrate their skills by jumping into the water. Before sunset, there is no room on the beach. Some are playing, some are kicking a ball, some are splashing in the water. Older people also come to life. The markets are experiencing a boom in trade, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to get through the dense crowd. To the traders, you look like a bag of money. In Stonetown, we realized that during our vacation, you probably won't have time to relax. If no one talks to you, someone else will immediately come over. To sum up, Stonetown impressed us with its multiculturalism and unique old town with ancient buildings with impressive doors. There are many historical buildings from the Portuguese era, the Arab period, Indian and African details. By the way, Freddie Mercury was born and lived here for a while. He is not very popular here. only because of his sexual orientation, because the island is Muslim. However, we found a small museum set up in his house. I really liked the cafes located on the terraces of houses or on the roofs. Here, with a cup of coffee, you can get away from the attention of the locals and admire the city from above. And now it's time to enjoy what most tourists come here for. We leave the bustling stone town in Zanzibar City. We are convinced that it can be difficult here during the rainy season, and we listen to a taxi driver's story about the problems of the locals on the island. Immediately after the revolution in 1964, Zanzibar merged with Tanganyika and formed the single state of Tanzania. Zanzibar remains in this union as a semi-autonomous state. Most of the island's residents did not support this project and still do not support it. In their opinion, Tanzania benefits more from them than they do from Tanzania. A person here who earns $10 a day is well off. About half of the island's population eats only once a day. The locals see how many tourists come to the island and know how much money the tourists leave here. However, they themselves earn little from it. We saw this when we arrived at the sandy coast. The first row of buildings is luxurious hotels owned by foreigners, and immediately behind them is a slum of local residents. Hotel employees are mostly locals and they earn no more than $10 a day. Although the prices of hotels and food there are like in Europe, and sometimes even more expensive. Now it is gradually becoming clear why the locals are trying so hard to please tourists, sell services, or wrap them around their finger. Other characters appear on the beautiful beaches of the island, the Maasai, the friendliest of all, with white smiles and colorful jewelry. Our first romantic walk along the beach lasted only 2 minutes. We didn't even have time to go to the waves. And so, every day, the hotel owner even offered us to take a Maasai hotel employee with us, so that the other Maasai would leave us alone. And it really works. While you talk to one, the others don't come closer. But if you walk alone, then look at the Maasai approaching you from all sides. The Maasai come to Zanzibar from the mainland of Tanzania, usually from the Kilimanjaro area. Recently, the nomadic Maasai have had difficulty finding water for their herds. They are increasingly being squeezed into poor lands by the expanding civilization. As a result, one child from the family is sent to earn money, usually the youngest, who knows a little English. In Zanzibar, the Maasai have found their niche. Arriving tourists love the dressed-up Maasai. Their communication is not intrusive, not annoying, so it is better to chat with them and walk on the beach than with the local inhabitants of the island. There are also many Maasai impersonators here. When you first arrive, it is difficult to distinguish them, but after staying longer, you begin to suspect. A real Maasai has his lower front tooth pulled out, has small tattoos on his face, and has a specific smell, because he smells of perfume made from animals. The Maasai mostly sell souvenirs, and sometimes keep women company if they feel very lonely. Hotels hire them as night watchmen because they need less sleep. They also have better hearing and vision at night. They have become so numerous on all the beaches that the local authorities have started chasing them away. But that didn't help. In the end, they were allowed to stay on the condition that they would look after the tourists and maintain their safety. Although there are a lot of tourists here, they are practically not seen on the beaches. Maybe because the beaches are wide and you can't see the beginning or end of them. Maybe because most of them stay in hotels for safety reasons or get tired of the locals' harassment. Maybe because most of them have gone on day trips, such as diving or visiting the surrounding islands. That's how many tourists we found near one of the most beautiful islands in Zanzibar. I say near because it is forbidden to set foot on the island itself. You can only sail near the island, jump from the boat into the water and swim on the island's beach. However, if you go ashore, you will be fined heavily. island belongs to Bill Gates, and he has a luxury hotel on the island, which is visited by various American and world celebrities. All boats are allowed to dock only at the miniature islet near Nemba Island. In addition, diving is allowed in the surrounding areas. A real corner of paradise. You will not be disappointed. Turquoise water and white sand, so fine that there is nothing to compare with. At low tide, huge areas of sandbanks are exposed, and at high tide, they are submerged. Almost everywhere in Zanzibar, during low tide, the underwater world opens up, which you can get acquainted with simply by walking. This world is best known to locals, although even children can show and tell a lot.
Hakuna matata.
When walking alone, it's very easy to step on a sea urchin or other creature, and then your vacation is over. I was taken by local children, and although they asked for astronomical prices afterwards and I had to negotiate, I still don't regret it. I learned that there are harmless sea urchins, and there are those that are better not to touch.
Small one is a papaya. To packing here, 5 minutes to come out.
No dienas, čia negau prisiliesti. Jeigu prisiliesi, iškart atostogom baigta.
I touched all kinds of sea creatures. Saw a sea cucumber. Visited a starfish museum, from which they made a Christmas tree for me. In addition, I saw what farms and gardens local women plant right in the sea.
Hi, you can eat it?
Yeah. Mother Jewish, China, the material. Habari gani? Nzuri sana. Tattoo.
I liked that the entire coast is not given over to tourists. Local life is always in full swing here. As soon as the sun rises, the beach becomes like a sports field. And if the tide is low in the morning, the locals rush to collect seafood, and the women tend to their seaweed gardens. Small children also walk around and pick something. A little later, when the fishermen return from the sea, the sharing of the catch begins, and trade. As the scorching sun rises higher, the action on the beach seems to slow down. Most people look for shade, but in the evening, everyone becomes more active again. The entire beach becomes like a football field, both older and younger, even women. The Maasai also form their own teams. It is difficult to even pass by because the game is going on persistently and no one is protecting you. Meanwhile, children and women dig in the sand with spoons and pick up shells, which they then eat with a specific sauce. As I already mentioned, for most people this is the only meal of the day. Of course, you can see the local life further from the beach, but the picture there is not so encouraging. Everywhere misery, poverty, and the abyss between civilizations. And if you go further on a scooter, you can also find local settlements, where even ancient thatched houses remain. In the middle of such settlements, there are usually large baobabs, and this baobab is the largest, seen during the entire trip. Baobab is very important here. Almost all parts of this tree can be used for food and other purposes. Moving around the island, we found the beach we liked the most, Mtende Beach. During the tides, the beach is completely submerged, but later a stretch of white sand is revealed. On one side, steep cliffs washed by ocean waves, and on the other, calm, warm water of the Indian Ocean. The impression is that this place is not yet so popular. There are only a couple of small hotels here, and most importantly, there are no Maasai or other locals trying to talk you into it at any cost. We finally found peace here. If you are already on the island, be sure to visit one of the caves. We visited a place not very well known to tourists and didn't meet a single person for an hour. In addition, it was very good to hide from the hot sun there. Religious ceremonies and sacrifices were once performed in such caves, and indeed, there was such a mystical atmosphere there, especially when there was nothing else around. If we have already talked about mystical places, then the mangrove forest has a similar atmosphere. These forests need seawater and significant tides. At first, we didn't understand how a mangrove forest appeared in the middle of the island, but then we checked the map and it became clear how this forest grew so far from the coast. Not far from here, there is another place that is worth visiting: the Jozani Forest. This is the only national park in Zanzibar. When you arrive here, you will pay a fee and get a guide who will take you around the territory and tell you about the animals of this forest. That is why most people come here. We are grateful to our guide, who took us a little further from the tourist crowds, showed us such strange animals as the Zanzibar elephant. But most importantly, we were able to observe the endangered red monkeys alone. It was an unprecedented feeling to observe these animals from a distance of about 5 meters. Some were already getting ready for lunch, others were looking after their babies. This species of monkey is disappearing mainly due to human activity. Their territory is gradually shrinking. Now this forest is protected and the monkey population is controlled. Interestingly, red monkeys do not tolerate sugar. They eat young leaves, seeds, and unripe fruits. But sugar is poisonous to them. To cleanse the body of toxic substances, they eat charcoal. Because of this, their population chooses places where coal is easily found. This species of monkey is found only on the island of Zanzibar, mainly in the Jozani forest. However, I was very surprised by what we found in the courtyard of our hotel. That's what was throwing our clothes away overnight. These are the same red monkeys. The hotel owner said that a family of these monkeys had recently moved here because they liked the trees on the hotel grounds. What surprised me was that they are not aggressive or as thieves as in Asia. We visited most of the island by scooter. There is little traffic except for Zanzibar City, and everyone drives carefully. This way, when you drive around the island, you see more of the life of the locals, stop where you want, and are not dependent on others. We also visited the famous cafe The Rock by scooter. This cafe is located on a cliff and is only accessible at low tide. It is an exclusive place with a great view of the sea and delicious food and cocktails. In the evening, we went to perhaps the only place on the East Coast where you can see the sunset. And in general, the scooter helped us visit most of the places mentioned in this video. So we had mixed impressions from the island of Zanzibar. Poverty, heat, garbage dumps, stomach problems, and the greed of the locals drove us to despair. We spent 3 weeks on the island and all their slow life. Poli Poli, which means slowly slowly, or Hakuna Matata, which means no problems, made us understand that they will have to dig out of this poverty for a long time. For 1 or 2 weeks, it is a wonderful place to relax from our civilized world. But for me, 3 weeks was already too much. On the other hand, an interesting history, sandy islands and the colors of the water, delicious fruits and seafood, all this pleased the hearts of us, curious travelers. Do not forget, once you have tasted travel, you cannot stop.